All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend, Katie Klabusich. Katie is a writer, a reproductive justice activist, a media contributor, all of which and more you can find at katiespeak.com. You can also follow her on Twitter at Katie_speak. Katie, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me back, Matt.
All right, so Katie, the last week and a half, I was actually on vacation. I had a little time off here, and while I was on vacation, the Washington Post went off the damn deep end, and they're pretty bad normally. I mean, they're normally, it's like you sort of like look at them with a little bit of a side eye, and you're like, yeah, you guys are pretty awful. But their normal horribleness hit a whole new level of ridiculous horribleness. There's a lot of instances, but specifically we're going to start with the man, the myth, the legend, George Will, and his horrific column when it comes to sexual assault. Tell the listeners, what the hell did George Will write?
Oh my. So George Will has this reputation somehow still as the thinking person's conservative. We don't agree with him, but he's not completely off the deep end. He isn't so awful. Like, he's just wrong, right? Like, that's our thought on him. Like, he's wrong on climate change. He's wrong on labor laws, but he's not he's not the, Rick Santorum, Newt Gingrichy level of awful. And then last weekend, he wrote a column essentially that I consider to be violent speech, because he's basically advocating against the punishment of violent felons, against rapists and people who commit sexual assaults. He says that, universities and colleges are being educated by Washington and finding the experience excruciating. And he's talking about the new Title IX task force that the White House put together after the Know Your Title IX activists delivered almost 200,000 signatures to the Board of Ed, demanding better transparency and better enforcement of Title IX laws, which require college campuses to not discriminate based on gender. Most famously, people know that as you have to have as many women's sports teams as men's sports teams, but it also covers things like sexual assault and safety on campus. And so the White House, to their credit, listened to activists like my good friend Ogate Wanjuki, and they're investigating and they're doing a lot for transparency, and it's really bringing a lot of relief to sexual assault survivors on college campuses. And since 20% of female students are assaulted during their time on campus, this is a big problem. So when George Will, a man with a large platform, a Fox News contributor, a man who regularly does the Sunday morning shows, and has had a column in the Washington Post, one of our nation's flagship papers, for decades, puts sexual assault and survivor in scare quotes for an entire column, and then it's published by the Washington Post, and then the editors at the Washington Post stand behind it, this is a big problem, because he's not saying anything that isn't widely thought in our culture that contributes to the rape culture.
No, it really is just, again, it's disgusting. And the column, you're just reading this, and it's like, how the hell is this in one of the biggest newspapers in the country? One of the, like you said, it's a flagship newspaper, and like, it's bad enough that this clown can write this and thinks this, and it's very indicative of what a lot of stupid ass dudes in this country think. And you're just like, okay, this isn't something that's necessarily out of the norm in our stupid ass society, right? But then the fact that this column got past an editor with, again, these quotes around it, like it is just like, it is so insulting, and then the editor's defense of it too was so insulting too. It just like, oh yeah, but it's infuriating, and like you said, it's really, really indicative of how rape culture is not just in individuals, it's actually so much in institutions, because that is what the Washington Post is. It's an institution.
Right. It's hard enough for survivors to come forward. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why survivors don't report. Small reason is that only about 3% of perpetrators see any kind of punishment by law. So that could be anything from a slap on the wrist and probation to jail time. And that's just, I mean, that's an astronomically minuscule number. And even if you do report, you then have to go through the process of retelling your story dozens of times. I mean, Zerlina Maxwell was posting about the Will column, and she talked about the number of times she had to retell her story just the first 24 hours between the emergency room and the nurses and the doctors and the first person to interview her, then time at the station and then people following up. I mean, you're just for a survivor to report, even if it goes well, you're asking them to relive it and retell it dozens of times. So the idea that, like he says in here, that survivors are coming forward now because we want coveted status. The idea that process of coming forward, even if it were to have some sort of successful ending with a rapist locked up behind bars for decades, which rarely happens, to think that someone would go through that process in order to achieve some sort of status is just unbelievably offensive. And my good friend Bogatwe saw it, and it was like one of those, like, we all have them when you're in public advocacy, like you hit like a breaking point, and it sounded a lot to her like he was saying we had privilege, and she was like, you've got to be kidding me. Survivor privilege? You mean like the tens of thousands of debt I have to a university I'll never graduate from? Oh yeah, that's really great survivor privilege. And she started a hashtag, and it was viral an hour later with just, I mean, like hundreds and thousands of people like commenting on it for days. And the Washington Post just basically their only comment was to say that this started a conversation and that people who had opposing viewpoints would be welcome to publish with them for free, by the way.
Right. You can write a letter to the editor. Hooray. How wonderful.
A group of Congress people got together and did write a response. And they reached out to some survivors and offered them the opportunity to write, basically an op-ed. But they didn't offer to pay anybody. I mean, the only person who got paid in this is George Will. So tell me again about my survivor privilege.